And by the way, while Dwight comes on stage, just an interesting thing. It's like, if I'm not mistaken, those two teams, Tomorrow and wireless and Datadog, are both coming from wireless generation, right? So we always talk about how we need more mafias in New York, successful companies that then produce people who then start their own company. And now we have an example here. And hopefully we're going to have a mafia with 10 gen soon, once you go public and make a ridiculous amount of money. So thank you very much. I was at the beginning, and by the way, so I'm going to ask you a few questions, but the whole point is to have you guys ask questions as early on as possible. But so I was mentioning, at the beginning that you're one of the legends of Silicon Alley, and I didn't mean to be embarrassing, but it's So you co-founded DoubleClick.
Yeah.
You were as a CTO for 10 years. And I was on a panel recently where one of the VCs that was speaking there was commenting that New York has had $2 billion exits in the last 10 years, and they were both DoubleClick, right? That's essentially what happened, right? So you got acquired twice with a company.
I haven't heard that joke before. But.
And then because that was not enough, you went on with Kevin Ryan to start Ali Corp, which has started so this Panther that got acquired, this Guild Group.
Right. Business Insider,
which is very helpful to know who are the top 10, angel investors and top 25 most successful companies in New York, which I read, which is my guilty pleasure, which I really like. And now 10gen.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's basically three areas I'd like to cover. I want to talk about the product, I want to talk about the business, and I want to talk about enterprise tech in New York. So starting with the product, so at a very high level, because we have an audience of both technical and non-technical people. And I know you don't like the term necessarily, but at a very high level, what is a NoSQL database?
So what is a NoSQL database? So I think it was it in 2009? There was the first NoSQL meetup, I think, in the summer in San Francisco. So someone coined that term, I think, around that meetup to give it a name. So it's a bit of a strange term, but I think we're kind of stuck with it for the moment. We could talk about big data maybe, but that's a little broader, so it's sort of like a subset therein. I think what they mean is kind of new generation, non-relational databases or data stores. And so it's not about the query language, the SQL part, but they are non-relational, at least the way I define the space. And it seems consistently in this space, there's been a lot of products over the last few years there. They've all been non-relational because people are trying to scale horizontally, including on commodity hardware and commodity networks, for example, in the cloud. And sort of how do you do that and how do you make it work well, right? And distributed joins is a hard problem. So the solution that's been chosen by both us with Mongo and the other NoSQL products is to say, we're not going to do joins. And then the question is, how do you build something that can actually do something interesting without that, right? So that's where the creativity comes in a little bit, I think.
Okay. Terrific. So what are the fundamental advantages of a NoSQL and NoSQL database over relational? So you mentioned scaling horizontally. What does that mean?
Yeah, it basically just means that you can take a large number of servers and make it one database cluster. It looks like one logical database. It looks like it's one machine, and they work together. So we can take 100 servers, say that's my database ABC, but I have the capacity and both in storage and computation and memory and RAM of 100 servers, not of one. And with traditional databases, it's hard to get them to scale horizontally, as we like to say. The traditional way to scale, if we go back, say, 20 years, was vertically, right? You could buy a bigger machine, right? You have a mini computer, you can buy a mainframe. You can buy a Sunbox. At DoubleClick, there are a lot of pieces of the system, but we used Oracle for certain things, like for storing business objects, like orders and customers and things. So we just bought the biggest boxes Sun made and had a couple of those, but then we would kind of run into that ceiling then. But that ceiling, it's gotten worse because computers are faster now, of course, but the delta between sort of a random kind of commodity server that would be in a data center in a rack and the fastest box you can get that's a single server, it's a lot smaller than it used to be, just because of the way computer architectures are headed, right? So, we're really getting into an era of kind of massive parallelism, both more cores in a single server, but also lots of servers working in parallel too, and you're going to need that parallelism at all levels of your application stack, right? So we need it. You need it at the application, you need it down at the bottom at the network layer, you need it for data processing, thus things like Hadoop exist, right? And you need it at the data layer too. And I think the data layer is one where the problem the parallelism problem, the massive parallelism problem, fully generalized hasn't been traditionally solved. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to do. Now that said, why would you use these things? That's reason number one, but there's another reason, right? It's not all about scale. There's a lot of people who run Mongo on one server, or maybe they have a replication they have 2 servers or 3, right? But they don't have a lot of servers, so they don't need the scale, so why are they using it? Yet they are. And the reason is basically because they're getting something from it they like that's not just scale, right? And what they're really getting from it is it makes development and building of apps really easy and productive, right? And it does that in a few ways. One way is just that the data model, the document-oriented data model in Mongo which is JSON-based, it's fairly close to the way we represent data in our programs, right? So almost all programming languages today have some object-oriented capability, even if they have other features. So JSON is a nice standards-based way to store object-style data that's not tied to any one programming language. So we like that. So that mapping from your program to the database is easy in general. I think that's one reason. Also, just the schemaless, quote-unquote, nature of the database within documents within the collections can have different fields, so it's more polymorphic and more dynamic. So that can be helpful for various reasons. One is just if your data is semi-structured, unstructured, or polymorphic, it's a lot easier to represent your data than it might have been in a traditional database. But in addition, if you're doing iterative development, software development methodologies, agile development, where you're doing continuous release cycles, right? So if we do a release every day or every week, we don't want to you probably don't want to do a schema migration script every day and a schema rollback script every day, right? In case something goes wrong. So by having this sort of dynamic schema or schemaless aspect to the product, it really fits well with the methodologies we use today for writing software too. So there's a whole dimension there, I think, where it can be very helpful, the product and some of the other products too, even independent of the scale one that people want to.
So are there still a number of cases where, for example, if your data is relational in nature, having a relational database still makes sense? I mean, no SQL, no SQL is not positioning as a total replacement to relational database, or is that not correct?
Yeah, so not a total replacement. I think one size fits all is over. But my belief, I'm a little biased, but my belief is that if we kind of project out, say, 5 years, 10 years, is that what we're going to see is you'll have a few tools in your toolbox for databases. Not 12, but more than one, maybe 3, for example. And you have a few niche things too, right, for special cases, but the standard things you use all the time. I feel like these NoSQL products, it's going to turn out that they are applicable to at least as many use cases as anything else you're using. So not everything, but they're not a niche. They're general purpose, at least some of them are, and I think that's our goal with Mongo. And so it will apply to as broad a swath of things as anything else does. And you're right, so you have to look at your problem and what tool is the best fit for it. So And the data model would be a good one to look at. So if your data looks like documents, if you're building a content management system, it would be sort of a no-brainer to consider something like Mongo with a document-oriented data model. Or if you have semi-structured, complex structured data, that can work well too. So, for example, if let's say we want to store derivative securities in a database, history of trades. How do you represent them in a database? Well, they're complicated. It's not like ticker, high, low, close. It's this very complex thing, and they're all different. And every day, a trader invents a new one, which has some new property that none has ever had before. So how do we code for that ahead of time? So that would be a good fit because of that kind of polymorphism or dynamic nature of the data that's just intrinsic to the problem. And then on the other hand, if you just stick with relational, if you have something that's fundamentally tabular, it might be a really good choice. So if for traditional accounting, use a relational database because your data is tabular just by its very nature.
So the NoSQL database segment or world, whatever you want to call it, has seen a lot of companies and open source projects appear. So there's key value stores, there's big table, there's graph databases. So Mongo falls in the document database, I believe. So can you help us understand the nuances between those categories and possibly which use case they're more applicable to?
Yeah, I think everything in the space has a goal. The way I define the space has a goal of scaling horizontally on commodity hardware. And after that, then you see some variation on a few dimensions. And one dimension is data model. So the data models tend to see are key value, then what I might call a big table style data model, which is kind of what like an HBase would use. Very similar to what's in the big table paper that they wrote a long time ago. And then the document-oriented model, which is used by some of the projects like Mongo or CouchDB and others. And then the graph databases too. I think this isn't, I think necessarily agreed by most people, but I personally think of graph databases as a thing unto themselves. Like this is a very interesting technology, graph databases, and if your data isn't going back to this question of what's the original shape of your data sort of before you even start building the system, if your data is a graph, look at graph databases. But I don't think if your data is not a graph, then trying to map it into graphs is not super intuitive to me, so I don't necessarily go there. So I feel like they're their own class of thing, and I would use them when I have graph data. And I would use something else when I don't. That's just kind of general purpose. So that would be the other things there. And my belief, which is opinion, is that in the end of these NoSQL data models, that the document-oriented model will be the one that kind of converges on for standard, and specifically JSON style or JSON based. So about half of the NoSQL products are JSON document-oriented. Quite a few have this big table data model. Some are just pure key value. But it's closer to the way we represent things in code. It's easy to read for a programmer. There's an RFC for JSON. And it just seems a little closer and more intuitive to the way we're working with the data as a developer to me, or as a tech person, than this sort of big table kind of multidimensional table thing. They're actually kind of similar. I mean, you could argue they're isomorphic, but kind of mathematically maybe, but from a sort of what's intuitive standpoint, and then also what has sort of a standard we can work with, and oh, by the way, a lot of the web stuff uses JSON anyway. I think that will make a lot of sense. And key value is really just, it's too simple, right? So there's a primary key to kind of opaque value blob thing, right? That's a pure key value store, which is great, but it's not going to cover the majority of your use cases. It's just too simple. And of course, you can easily implement a key value store in anything else because we can implement it in MySQL, we can implement it in Mongo, we can implement it in HBase. It's just a question of speed then. And of course, it'll be, if you write only a key value store, it'll be very fast probably, and it'll probably scale very well because that's all it does. It'll probably be really good at that. But our philosophy is you're going to want more than that, right? So we want Mongo to cover a fairly broad set of use cases. So our philosophy is actually to be feature heavy. And we think there's a few features that are incompatible with scale out, right? That we'll never put in Mongo. But the other features we want to put in. And that's what we're trying to do. So the product has things like ad hoc queries and secondary indexes and sorting and things that if I told you a database didn't have them and we weren't in this world right now, you'd find odd. So standard stuff that's not surprising in some ways.
And you just released a new version, right? 2.2?
Yeah, the 2.2 release just came out, so you can download it. It's available. What we were doing is every 0.2 increment is a major release, right? So 1.6, 1.8, 2.0, 2.2. Those are all kind of same size releases. So those even numbers I mentioned are the stable release branches, and the odd branches are the development branches. So the 2.2 release just came out recently.
So what does that do? Or in general, what is sort of on the roadmap for the next?
Right. So I'll start with what's in 2.2 versus 2.0. So I really think of this release, the 2.2 release, as one that's really sort of a maturing of the product, a rounding out of the product sort of release. So there's a bunch of new features, but they're kind of mostly oriented towards that theme. First of all, there's a new aggregation framework. So it's a way to run queries that do aggregation in Mongo easily and that perform well. So it's really for reporting. So Mongo's always had a query language. It's not SQL, but it has this Mongo query language. You can do ad hoc queries. But it didn't have comprehensive sort of aggregation type operations. And I'm not sure it's quite comprehensive yet, but it's like 10 times better than it was, so it's pretty good. So, but it has this now, so it's a lot of things that you would, if you're using the group by operator in SQL, you're probably using the aggregation framework in Mongo in 2.2. So that's a big new feature. That's a whole subsystem, if you will, that we're pretty excited about. So that's new in 2.2. In addition, there are big concurrency improvements in the 2.2 release of Mongo. Historically in Mongo, sort of the concurrency in a single MongoD process on a single server has been suboptimal. And between servers, it's been good, but inside a single server, it needed a lot of work. So there was a global reader-writer lock, which has been eliminated, and a bunch of work went into there, including having good parallelism and concurrency, like on secondaries when they apply writes. There was a lot of work done there and a lot of pieces. There's a video on the site that details all that. There's some new features around data center awareness and what we call tag-aware sharding, which lets you do some pretty neat things with data when you're in multiple geographies with a cluster. Another new feature is TTL collections, where you can automatically age things out. And then there's 100 little improvements.
In terms of a roadmap?
Roadmap. So going forward, so one of the big items, there's a couple of big items on the roadmap. One is better, easier operations, right? So I think Mongo is easy to code to at this point. It scales well at this point. And if we go back a couple of years in time, then we could debate some of these things. But if you look at the current point in time status, and operations are okay, but could be better. So we want to do a lot of work there. So if you have a large cluster, we want to make operating it easier, and so we're doing a lot of work around that. So you have a 200 server Mongo cluster. You want to upgrade. What do? Well, right now you're going to do it yourself. You're going to write a script or write something in Chef or something and probably do it, right? So the goal would be that a lot of those common administrative DevOps operations are made easier. So that's a big priority on the roadmap right now. Another one is security features. We're getting tons and tons of requests for all kinds of security features. I think that's in part just as bigger organizations that are using the product. A lot of the banks are using the product. and financial services, also, some governments using it, and from everyone. So those are a couple things, and then there's just there's a long list of sort of improvements on individual little subsystem modules inside the product we just want to make better.
Okay, great, thanks. So let's talk about the business side a little bit and the business model. So you decided, I guess, a few years ago to open source the product, but I believe that was not the case initially. And as we all know, open source is it's, I guess, a strategy, if you want, that more and more companies seem to be using. So how do you decide to open source a product, and then what are the keys to making that effort successful?
Yeah, so it was always open source. When we first started working on it, we were thinking about platform as a service and having it be part of a stack, and then we focused solely on Mongo fairly quickly, but that stack was also open source, so it's kind of always been open source. What to think about? I think with open source, it's sort of one thing I would look at is just how big is the market you're in, because you are going to get some revenue compression, right, by being open source versus non-open source if you have the same number of users, right? So if you're in a big market, that's okay. There's still plenty of room, right? And then the other thing would just be sort of, is it mission critical? So databases are mission critical. So I feel like conceptually, if we provide good service, people will be willing to pay us. But, if I have something that's sort of like very discretionary, right? Like maybe my version control system is super important to me, but if it's down for 4 hours a year, the world won't end. Like no production systems crashed, for example. So do I buy commercial support for that and services? And it's like, well, I might, but it'll be more optional. So I think that's the other aspect there. And you kind of look at those two things.
So assuming you have those two things, how do you go about building a community? How do you make sure that it's alive, that people contribute, that
That's a good question. It's hard, and we've done a lot of work on it, and I think you got to be very focused on that if you are doing an open source product. And I think it's very common to just do one, and it's not even a company. You just want it to be used a lot, right? So you can imagine doing something like that too. You have the same problem though, right? So you got to get the community to be vibrant and active, and I think part of it is just being really proactive on that with the community, getting out there as much as possible, talking about it, meetups and things. But then the other part is you got to get people a little bit passionate about it. They got to, they have to kind of get it and to that level. If somebody likes the product, they'll use it. They won't tell anyone about it. If they love it, they'll tell their friends about it. And of course, if they don't like it, they won't use it. So if everybody likes it, but nobody loves it, I think that can be a challenge.
Okay. So another thing that you guys have done, I think you've done, and I don't know if that was a strategy or that was circumstantial, but you seem to have gained a lot of initial traction with Web 2.0 startups, for lack of a better term. And then you've been very successful, especially lately, at scaling that up and getting large enterprise customers. So I guess, is that what happened? Was it deliberate? And if so, would you recommend that? I mean, a lot of startups in the Valley and here, enterprise tech startups, seem to be doing the same thing, right? Where they go after a lot of other startups as initial test case, and again, an initial customer foothold, and then they try to leverage that.
Yes, that's what happened, and the startups tend to be early adopters, right? They're innovative, they're not that risk averse, et cetera. And for this NoSQL space, there was a lot of interest from that startup world, and just because there have been NoSQL products built at companies like Google and Amazon, although they were internal projects, they weren't available publicly. So there was kind of a culture there, I think, of where that felt somewhat normal in that world. And then over time, as kind of things mature, then it's branched out, and now there's a lot of enterprise usage of NoSQL, and including MongoDB, including Fortune 20 companies and things like that. So it's great, but I think there exist things that startups would like that wouldn't make that transition, right? So if I were starting something new and we thought that were important, which for monetization it's certainly important. If you just say, I want lots of usage, it would be totally fine if startups used it only. I would think about, is this something that will kind of be of interest to enterprises?
And how do you help that transition at some point? Because, those are almost different type of sales, right? One, especially doing startups at scale, you can download the product, and then this minimal, help you provide when you go and sell to a large account. Then, it's a longer sales cycle. You have to have salespeople. How did you manage that?
Well, I think you do all the normal things, like have a sales force and do traditional kind of classic sales to enterprises. But I think that transition of the product moving into bigger companies has been very organic, right? And they use it because, one, they've heard of it just because there's enough usage that there's awareness out there, and they find it useful. So I think from day one, our intent with the design of the product was that it would be useful for organizations of all sizes. And, if you're building something that can scale up and hopefully you're building something that's robust, then in theory it should be useful to enterprises. I think a lot of the thinking behind Mongo, it's sort of what I wish I had at DoubleClick. And we were doing some kind of fairly complicated things, and there was scale there, and we could never be down, and almost never, and so it was. There was a bit of a rigor to it, so that was always in the back of our heads. So it makes sense to me that the product can be used in all these different sectors.
So a couple more questions, and then I'll open it up to people. If you were going to start something today, let's say, in the big data world, what are some of the areas that you think are interesting versus, played out for people thinking about starting their own company?
So there was, actually saw this on Business Insider a week or two ago. There was, I forget who it was, someone at Sequoia had said that entrepreneurs right now are ignoring B2B.
Jim Goetz.
Jim, yeah, okay. So I read that and I thought, he's right. So I think there is an underweighting of activity on B2B because there's plenty of opportunity there. And, businesses need things. They spend lots of money. They have problems to be solved. So my first thought is look at B2B, right? So, because it's a little bit of like a game theory thing, is sort of, if you're trying to solve the same problem as everybody else and there can only be one winner or three winners, then it's going to be hard. If no one else is working on the product you're working on and it actually is a real space in the end, your probability of success would be higher. So I think it's partially that. You don't want to start working on a new idea and 500 people are simultaneously trying to do that new idea at the same time. And I think the B2B space is sort of the underweighted case right now, competitively, kind of at the startup phase.
And any more specifically within big data, are you more interested in not on applications, analytics, infrastructure, data transfer, or not? I'm
sure there's a lot of good ideas that I haven't even thought of. So, but I thought the presentations tonight were interesting, and I kind of fall in that area, or this theme, let's say,
of making hard data and complex problems more accessible to a broader audience.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity to do things around NoSQL, even that aren't NoSQL databases per se, but there's going to be entire ecosystems there, and the database market's a big market. So, for example, analytics presentation tools that work with these products. People want those things. Might be an opportunity for people to build things like that, or a million other things like that. So that would be one example. Mongo uses it's a JSON database. The internal representation is a thing called BSON, which stands for binary JSON, which is just a binary representation of JSON, which provides for fast scannability and adds a couple data types, like a date data type. But I think, for example, interesting things could be done with BSON that aren't Mongo, but just BSON itself, maybe, some sort of web services type technologies or message bus technologies, using it, I think would be an example of something where you could kind of take take that momentum there a little bit and go do something new that's adjacent.
Okay, great. And last question from me, New York. So you are one of the very few enterprise tech companies in New York, and certainly the one that seems to be doing the best. There's a lot of interesting new companies coming up, but you're the figurehead. Opportunities, challenges, raising money, finding talent. You open an office in Palo Alto as well. What's the lay of the land?
Yeah. We do have an office in Palo Alto. We have a lot of people there too. In part we did that because there's talent there to hire, and in part we have a tremendous number of customers and users there that we just have to, deal with and service and be there. So it made sense for a lot of reasons. I'm actually finding right now, because we're hiring engineers both locations, that we're having a little more luck hiring engineers in New York. And it's just, I think it's hard to hire everywhere right now. There's not enough engineers. We need more. Like if there were more visas, I think that would be useful for that reason, because there's zero unemployment there and there's more demand than supply. But it's super competitive on the hiring of engineers out there. It's also quite competitive here. But the nice thing for us, I think, is that our kind of what we kind of offer to someone, an engineer, if you want to come work at Tengen, in New York, it's kind of unique, right? We're doing system software and that kind of stuff, and not doing applications engineering. So it's a little different than kind of most of the other kind of more startup-like opportunities in New York, right? Because in general, I think the New York startup scene, it's a little bit more like San Francisco and a little less like Silicon Valley, at least traditionally. I'm not sure where both of these companies were today. I know you guys are here. You both here, yeah. So these are tech companies, like in a kind of a pure sense. So they're here. So we'll see what happens. So, but it would be nice to see more kind of a pure tech companies in New York versus internet, new media, mobile things, which are quite vibrant already. I guess there are some, but they're vertical. Maybe Bloomberg, ZocDocs.
Could part of the problem be that it's harder to raise money at the seed level? I mean, you're in a completely different category because of your track record, right? But if you are a first-time entrepreneur trying to do enterprise tech in New York, is a hurdle the bar higher?
So I think it's changed. I think it's not harder now, which is good. I think New York has been underserved, at least for the IT tech type world. Maybe not for healthcare or something venture, but underserved in terms of sort of the number of kind of venture firms and VCs in New York. Right, it was underweighted historically, but I think that's changed. I think everyone's paying attention to New York. All the West Coast firms are, Boston firms. See people moving here, like from Boston, right, who are VCs and they live here now, and quite a bit of that. So I think it's totally fine now, and
you're probably in large part to thank for that. The fact that Tengen appeared.
I think it's one of. And there's a lot of things. Tumblrs and Foursquares and ZocDocs, for example. Tech, right? Yeah, but on the enterprise tech, yeah. But I think once they're saying, well, we're doing investments in New York, and I know I'll be there for board meetings anyway. I think if they're pretty broad in their categories they look at, they wouldn't mind.
Okay. Terrific. Questions?
My name is Carlos, and I work for Lockheed Martin. I just want to know when are you going to provide a security for Mongo, and also if you're going to go for the government contracts, like defense contracting.
Yeah. So, question about security and government contracts and so forth. Yeah. So we do have some government customers, and actually we announced about a week ago that InQtel invested in Tenjin, right? So which is great. There's already some usage. Actually, federal, state, local. There's a good amount of government usage. The UK government uses Mongo for some things, which is pretty neat. Use it? Okay. Yeah. So we're very interested in that sector. We have a couple people who work for Tenjin in DC today. We're the 2.4 release, which will be the next release, will have a lot of new security features in it, and I'm hoping that's out in Q1. The 2.2 release took quite a while, but there was a lot of stuff in it. 2.4 we're going to try to get out a little sooner with a little less broad scope, but security is definitely one of the top items for that release. And we're getting lots of requests. We're getting both government requests for security features and also financial services. There's a lot of financial services usage now, which wasn't the case maybe a year ago, but they're all asking for security features. So that's definitely coming.
Hi, A.B. Mendez with Knight Capital. One question, I got two questions, if I may. The first one, as a former data warehouse architect, kind of 10 years ago, and star schema databases and dimensional relational, trying to get my mind around NoSQL and unstructured data. I've heard it described that there are certain scenarios where you can take unstructured data and put that together with structured data, and there's more power that can be taken from only the unstructured or only the structured. Maybe that's with time as kind of a unifying element, or with no unifying element. If there is an example that comes to mind that you could share.
Yeah, and I like to sometimes use the word semi-structured because I think unstructured is potentially confusing. Like if you think of full text search, right, with Verity or Solar or something, that's what I think of as pure unstructured. Where in Mongo there is structure, it's just kind of dynamic and polymorphic. So, for example, one example is Telefonica built an app which they just wanted to create a product catalog of their products. And, if you think about it, they sell everything from, phone covers to phones to service plans to, they have, it's a giant company. They have 1 million products and they're very different, right? They have all these different attributes, including, service plans will have, how many minutes you have per month. But, if you buy a phone for your house, it's very different. So the fact that they could have these different attributes for the different products and put them all in a products collection worked out very well for them. So that would be one example, I think.
Okay, great, thank you. And the second question, I've been thinking a lot more recently about sort of what I would call like the consumerization of big data. I think each individual now spits out so much data across, if you were to think about everyone that I'm friends with on Facebook or Twitter and all the data that's flowing through their pages, not to mention just my own, Fitbit was shown earlier as a personal, application of data. Is there a potential for, MongoDB to be applied, within Facebook, within Twitter, to let individuals better analyze the large streams of data that are flowing through their own social networks? And then sort of the same thing on mobile devices around location and so forth. Just the idea of a paid app or a paid service that lets the individual get more out of big data.
I'm not sure about the last part, but but Facebook and Twitter, they do use NoSQL products. I'm not sure if they use Mongo. I mean, I think they use some different things, and Google uses NoSQL. They use Bigtable, and I think there's been things they've built on top of Bigtable over time. But I think there's a lot of that usage happening, I think, today.
Okay, and that's not specifically an opportunity for Mongo that you're probably eternally.
Well, I think it is. I mean, a lot of these companies, like eBay uses Mongo, for example, and Disney and Shutterfly, and so. But I really see it as very horizontal and general purpose, right? So we want all these different verticals to use it, not to focus too much on one. So we want financial services to use it. We want healthcare to use it. We want media companies to use it. We want telcos to use it. We want startups to use it.
Hi. Great talk. I had a quick question about batch aggregation. I have seen 2.0 version of Mongo, and I'm wondering, what have you improved on batch aggregation? How are you integrating with Hadoop and ETL, vice versa?
Yeah, so you said you use 2.0?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the aggregation framework in 2.2 provides sort of a native way to do aggregations in Mongo using a query language that's kind of like group by in SQL. So that's what's new there. In addition, and this has been there for a while, for example, it was in 2.0, there's a native MapReduce built into Mongo that's based on JavaScript. And in addition, there is a Hadoop connector, right? So quite a few people now use Mongo with Hadoop via the connector because Hadoop proper, right, is it's a computational framework or engine, right? So you could use it with any storage engine or source and sync. So it fits well with Mongo. I think Hadoop or HBase, which is a Hadoop sub-project, that's something that's more of an alternative or competitive with Mongo, where you would look at A versus B, but if that makes sense.
But have you improved on it, as in 2.0 to 2.22 or 2.4? Have you plans on it? Because I like Mongo 2.0, but batch aggregation, I would probably won't use it, and I want to use it.
What did you try in 2.0? What? No, with Mongo, what did you try?
We brought in data from a NoSQL and put it to a structured one.
Yeah, I think in 2.0, like there wasn't a lot of aggregation features, so it would be challenging. I think so. There's a lot more of those in 2.2. It's much different, much better. And in addition, the Hadoop connector is much better now too. That has evolved a lot over the last few months.
Thank you. Andrew Dinsmore from RapidEye. One question with the open source business model. How do you find or how do you optimize that conversion from the sort of free download client to a full paying client?
Well, one, you need to know they exist, right? So and then two is, can you, like if I know you're using the product and I call you, can I convince you to pay me? Right, so you have two problems. So the first one's more of a lead gen problem. So you could do all the traditional things people do, including things like, registrations for webinars and things like that, which give you contact info. But also just today, things like LinkedIn sometimes tell you that an organization is using a given product. So I think it's a little easier than it used to be on the discovery side. And of course, they might call us too. Then it's just, but are they willing to pay you, right? And so there's a lot of nuances to that. There's sort of, am I able to pay? Do I have a budget? So are my users, do they have that capability or that option? And then if they are able, are they willing, right? You have to give them a reason. So they have to feel like they're getting some value. And I think databases are mission critical, so people want 24/7 production support. So we sell them that in our subscription. And then in addition, we have, as part of that subscription, there is a subscriber edition, which has a few extra features. And today, it's a very tiny bit of extra features. Over time, we'll put more of these add-ons that are for customers only in there, but they'll be super enterprisey things, right? So right now, I think the only thing in the subscriber edition right now that is non-free is SNMP support, for example. So we thought that was a good one. Certain security things I think would make sense in there, and some maybe that everyone needs them, so they shouldn't be in there. So I think the way we're thinking about it right now with Mongo is, if you're a startup you're working in your basement, and you don't have any money yet, you should have everything you want or need in Mongo for free, right? But, if you're a Fortune 500 company, hopefully there's some things that we can give you that add value that you're willing to pay for.
Okay. Couple more. Yep.
Hi, I'm Michael Selleck, I guess independent data science consultant. I was wondering if you've read the Google Spanner paper, and how you think that'll affect demand for NoSQL in general, and I guess scalable products.
You want to explain what the paper is for the rest of you?
Sure. Google has published a document describing a new global data store that provides transactions and some interesting features. I haven't fully digested it myself, but I've thought expert here.
Right. So that paper on Spanner, it's pretty new, right? It's a few days old, so it's in my inbox. I haven't read it yet. I think one or two folks at work have. So I don't have any opinion on it yet, but I'll have to take a look. I mean, I think, I think it's mostly talks about transactions, though, and transactions are one of the big ideas from databases, so they're important, right? So, but the challenge is with the distributed system, can you do them, right? So if we have 1,000 server cluster running on commodity hardware on a commodity network, and you want to touch data and mutate it that's on 600 servers, and then you want to commit that all or nothing with isolation and option to roll it back, and you want it to have super high throughput and be fast, you can't really do that, right? So, so we don't do it. We don't try to do that. What we do currently in Mongo is we do these little microtransactions, which sort of say, I give you ACID properties, but only on a single document at a time, right? Because a single JSON document lives on one and only shard in a Mongo cluster at a given point in time, so then it becomes pretty easy to do that. But fortunately, these documents can be pretty rich, right? It could have 1,000 fields and lots of hierarchy and nesting and arrays. So sometimes that'll get you pretty far, but you have to think about that during schema design. And of course, it doesn't always map, right? There's lots of things we could think of where you'd say, nah, that's not going to work. I'm going to need more than that, right? So it would be nice over time to have more, but that's kind of where we are right now. And in general, in the NoSQL space, in terms of the publicly available products, we're kind of at the high end of the kind of transactionality spectrum, I would say, even though we're in some ways quite low.
All right, one last question. There was a nod.
Hi.
Yep.
I'm Rick Richardson from Bloomberg. I noticed that MongoDB is probably one of the few NoSQL databases out there that isn't the result of a paper from Amazon or Google. But thanks for that. What was actually the original concept for 10gen or Mongo? Did you envision of a company that was going to create a new database, or were you creating something else and someone built an indexing JSON server, or how did that happen?
And also, what's behind the name?
Right. So the name is the middle of the word humongous. So it was kind of a play on this concept of scale, right? So that's where the name came from. So the way we got started is we were looking at cloud computing, right? And we started prototyping and building this actual whole stack, a whole platform as a service stack. And as we started designing it, and we were thinking about cloud and things like elasticity and scale should be easy because they are in the cloud for some things. Like this is about 5 years ago. So like Amazon S3, right? Fully elastic, right? So traditional databases, not so much. So and it was sort of a question of, and then we also wanted something that felt easy, right? Easy to work with or develop to, because that felt like a cloud computing principle too. So we were thinking about, well, what should the data layer of the stack be? And we looked at the traditional stuff, and we thought, well, could we take something? Can we take Postgres and start changing code and make something we like? And we felt like we would never land where we wanted to get to if we did that. So we started with a blank sheet of paper and started writing the product, and it was partly just kind of creating what we thought we would want as developers and people who ran systems, and it kind of evolved from there.
So you did, all right, I mean, had you founded 10gen at this point, or were you were endeavoring to start up a new startup?
We
into this
had
space,
founded
or-
10gen, but basically day one we had started on, or day two we started on Mongo. So we started the project, and 10gen wrote the first line of code, right? So that's how it got its start. Now there's a pretty big community and ecosystem, including other companies doing various things. So it's great, but that's how it got started. So it's contrast. There's a lot of times you'll have like an Apache project. It's getting really popular, and someone says, "Okay, I'm going to create a company around that because people need various commercial services around this product," and it makes perfect sense. So that's not the case here. It's sort of the other scenario where a little bit more maybe like MySQL originally, right, where it was a little tighter relationship with the company, even if they did write code before they started it. It was kind of it was not the Apache project, for example.
Great. So Dwight is going to be around for a little while longer after this. Or you need to run, or you're going to be?
Yeah, a few minutes.
A few minutes. So if you have any more questions, so big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And time to go drink now.